What if I told you there's a book so disturbing, so brutally raw, that even hardened critics called it evil? A book so haunting that schools banned it, libraries locked it away, and even psychologists warned it could damage readers' minds? And it's one of the most disturbing books ever written. This isn't horror. It's not fantasy. It's something far worse. Because The Painted Bird doesn't invent monsters, it shows us what human beings, ordinary human beings, are capable of. And here's the kicker. The man who wrote it, he lived a life just as controversial and just as dark as the book itself. Tonight, we're going deep into the most terrifying novel you've probably never read. And by the end, you might wish you hadn't. This is The Painted Bird. Hey, welcome back to That One Book, where we dig up the wildest, strangest, and most unforgettable stories ever written. And today, buckle up, because this isn't just literature. This is trauma, controversy, and mystery bound in paper. Now, before we dive in, a warning. This one isn't just dark. It's one of the most brutal books of the 20th century, but it's also one of the most important. Because The Painted Bird isn't just about war. It's about what happens when civilization itself collapses. When The Painted Bird first hit shelves in 1965, it was hailed by some as a masterpiece of Holocaust literature. But for others, it was a grotesque exaggeration. A book so cruel, so disturbing, that it deserved to be locked away. And if you stick with me, you'll see why this book has been praised as a masterpiece, condemned as obscene, and why, decades later, it still leaves readers shaken. All right, let's step into the nightmare. So, what's this book actually about? Published in 1965, The Painted Bird tells the story of a young boy, unnamed, wandering alone through Eastern Europe during World War II. His parents, fearing persecution, sent him away to hide among peasants. He's separated from his parents and forced to survive by drifting from village to village. But instead of finding safety, he finds the darkest corners of humanity. This boy, maybe 6, maybe 7, spends the entire book being passed from one village to another village. And everywhere he goes, he's met with cruelty, violence, and dehumanization. Everywhere he goes, he's beaten, tortured, starved, and abused. Not because he's done anything wrong, but because he's different. The villagers call him a gypsy, a Jew, a demon child. They project all their fears and hatred onto him. And through his eyes, we see war not as tanks and battles, but as something more terrifying. Ordinary people, stripped of morality, turning into executioners. One critic put it like this: "This is not a story about Nazis. It's a story about neighbors, and that's what makes it unbearable." So why The Painted Bird? There's a scene in the novel where villagers capture a bird, paint its feathers in bright colors, and release it back to its flock. But instead of welcoming it, the other birds attack and kill it because it looks different. That's the metaphor of the entire book. The boy is the painted bird, marked, alien, condemned, not for who he is, but for what others see in him. And here's what makes it so disturbing. The writing is brutally detached. Kosiński doesn't sensationalize. He doesn't soften. He just describes. Plain, cold, and unflinching. At times, you almost forget you're reading fiction, which is exactly where the trouble begins. And if that makes your stomach turn, good, because this is where the novel really begins to test you. The book is basically a chain of brutal vignettes. Each new village the boy enters is worse than the last. He's beaten for looking different. He watches villagers burn suspected witches alive. He's forced to witness unspeakable acts of sexual violence. He sees animals tortured, women abused, men humiliated. At one point, he's even buried alive. And here's the thing, it doesn't feel like fiction. Kosiński's writing is cold, detached. He doesn't sensationalize the violence. Why, he just describes it matter-of-factly, which somehow makes it worse. The effect is hypnotic. You keep asking yourself, why am I still reading this? But you can't look away. Because beneath the horror, you realize this isn't just war. This is what happens when morality breaks down. When the book was published in 1965, it exploded. Some critics compared it to the works of Kafka, Camus, even Dostoevsky. They said it captured the essence of human cruelty during war like no other novel. The New York Times called it a vision of the world that is unrelentingly dark but undeniably powerful. But others, they were horrified. Schools banned it. Libraries locked it away. Religious groups condemned it. Psychologists warned that its graphic depictions could trigger PTSD in Holocaust survivors. And here's the fascinating part. The outrage wasn't just about the violence, it was about the authenticity. Because many readers believed Kosiński wasn't writing fiction. They thought he was telling his own story. Which brings us to the heart of the controversy. So, was The Painted Bird fiction or autobiography? When it first came out, people assumed it was autobiographical. Kosiński leaned into the ambiguity. He gave interviews where he hinted it was based on his childhood. He allowed people to believe that he was the boy, that he had survived these horrors as a child in Nazi-occupied Poland. Readers were horrified and fascinated. A survivor's voice telling the unfiltered truth. And why wouldn't he? In the 1960s, survivor stories had immense power. People wanted raw truth about the Holocaust, and his book fit perfectly into that hunger. But later, when historians started asking questions, Kosiński backpedaled. He said, "It's a novel. It's fiction. The boy is not me." This back and forth created one of the biggest literary mysteries of the 20th century. Because if it was autobiography, it's horrifying. But if it was fiction, why write something so dark, so grotesque, and frame it so closely to reality? Even worse, Polish historians and survivors began pointing out flaws. They said his depictions of peasants as barbaric, animalistic brutes were exaggerated, even slanderous. They argued he painted rural communities as monsters, fueling harmful stereotypes. Historians later discovered that Kosiński actually spent the war years hidden safely by a Polish Catholic family. His childhood was traumatic, yes, but nothing like the nightmare in The Painted Bird. This revelation caused outrage. Was he exploiting Holocaust imagery for shock value? Was the book a fraud? And that's when the bans really piled up. Even today, critics are split. Some call him a liar. Others say it doesn't matter. Because fiction can tell truths, reality can't. And honestly, that tension between truth and invention is part of what makes this book so unsettling. The backlash was intense. By the late 20th century, The Painted Bird was banned in schools across America and Europe. Some called it pornography of violence. Others accused it of being anti-Polish propaganda. And still others insisted it was valuable, and precisely because it was so disturbing. Scholars fought over it. Was Kosiński giving voice to the voiceless, or was he exploiting atrocity for art? Meanwhile, rumors swirled that Kosiński hadn't even written it himself. Whispers of ghostwriters followed him for years. Some claimed he relied heavily on editors or even translators to craft his English prose. Others accused him of outright plagiarism in his later novels. Even psychologists weighed in. One said the book could cause psychological harm if read without preparation. And yet, it kept selling. It got translated into more than 30 languages. It became a staple in debates about censorship, free expression, and the ethics of literature. And in 2019, it was even adapted into a film so graphic that people literally fainted in theaters. This isn't just a book, it's a cultural scar. And here's the most tragic part. Jerzy Kosiński wasn't just controversial, he was haunted. After years of defending himself against accusations of fraud, plagiarism, and exploitation, his reputation collapsed. And in 1991, Kosiński took his own life. He was 57. On May 3rd, 1991, Jerzy Kosiński was found dead in his Manhattan apartment. He was found in his bathtub, a plastic bag tied around his head. In a suicide note, he wrote, "I am going to put myself to sleep now for a bit longer than usual. Call it eternity." Even in death, he left us with a riddle. Was he a survivor who turned trauma into art? Or a trickster who fabricated darkness to shock the world? The truth died with him. For some, his suicide was the tragic end of a brilliant but tortured writer. For others, it was proof that he'd lived a lie, that the weight of accusations, the controversy, the blurred line between truth and fiction had finally crushed him. Either way, it sealed The Painted Bird's place as one of the most cursed, haunting novels of the 20th century. So where does that leave us? Today, The Painted Bird is still studied, but cautiously. It's part of Holocaust literature, but also part of banned books lists. It's praised as visionary, but condemned as exploitative. In 2019, it was adapted into a film, nearly 3 hours long, shot in stark black and white, with violence so graphic that people walked out of theaters. Critics were divided again. Some called it a masterpiece. Others said it was unwatchable. And that's the legacy of this book, division. Some say it's a necessary reminder of how war strips away humanity. Others say it's cruelty for cruelty's sake. But here's what no one can deny. Once you read it, you don't forget it. So, what do we do with a book like The Painted Bird? On one hand, it's almost unbearable. On the other, it's unforgettable. It forces us to stare at the ugliest parts of human nature. The cruelty that doesn't come from monsters, but from ordinary people, when society crumbles and morality erode. Whether Kosiński lived it or invented it doesn't change the effect. Once you've read it, it's inside you. Like a stain you can't wash out. And maybe that's the point. Because sometimes the books we most want to ban, burn, or bury are the ones that refuse to let us look away from ourselves. That was The Painted Bird, one of the darkest novels ever written, and one of the most controversial. Now I've got to ask you, would you ever read it? Or do you think some books really do go too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be replying to as many as I can. And if you want me to keep digging into banned and forgotten books that shook the world, hit that subscribe and the bell because we've got more stories like this coming. Until next time, some books change you. This one, it haunts you.